Thank you so much, Giovanni and DUCIGS for hosting this seminar. This is a friend's conversation. I know, as Bill said, I met Marga last year in Trieste in the Science Diplomacy Training of Trainers, and she's going to be our first speaker. Marga is from the Mediterranean island of Mallorca. I don't know, where are you, Marga, now? Are you in Madrid right now?
No, in Mallorca.
Excellent. In Mallorca, okay. So you are in the same coast with Mauricio. He's in Costa del Sol. She has been trained in 4 continents and is what I would call a science diplomacy evangelist. She has a consultancy firm, which is SciDipGLOBAL, and is something that she has been developing with the years, and she has already helped many governments in Latin America to design and to sound implement their science diplomacy strategies, which is quite important because we are talking about the global south. But she also wears so many hats. She's advisor of the European Union Science Diplomacy Cluster, and she is a World Academy of Science Academy of Science scholar and a global leader of the World Economic Forum. I believe you have access to her biography, but you will agree with me, she is a science diplomacy architect. And as a science diplomacy architect, she is going to present to us the building blocks of science diplomacy in this very seminal stage of this program at Duke. Our second speaker is also a friend of mine, is Mauricio Calderon. He's connecting from, as I said before, from the Costa del Sol in Spain, but he's a man of many lives. Mauricio Calderon is a medical doctor by profession. He practiced for more than 15 years as a co-director of the Vascular Diagnosis Division and Vascular Diagnosis Laboratory at the Miami Heart Institute in Florida, and later at a different level as a chief medical officer in Colombia. He more recently joined the United Nations and have been serving with the United Nations as a WHO senior coordinator in different continents, in Latin America with the Pan American Health Organization, in West Africa, where actually I met Mauricio 5 years ago in the response to Ebola. And he has been also coordinating the whole of Syria crisis with duty station in Oman. But Mauricio is now fully dedicated to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals as an essential part of something that he calls the sustainability of humanitarian action. That is something that we really look after in the humanitarian sector. He co-founded in 2018 Sustainable Healthy Habits and Healthy Humans, and one of the objectives of SS4P, as it's called, is contribute to knowledge cross-fertilization and translation between humanitarians, development, and peace and security actors. So welcome, Mauricio. Bienvenidos todos. The floor is yours, Marga.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful introduction, Chris. I'm delighted to be with you today and to be the first speaker of this wonderful series. I think we all agree that rethinking diplomacy is probably the most appropriate topic that we have right now. And I fully agree with Bill about how, unfortunately, COVID-19 is giving us a kind of life case study, which we don't have to forget that it's not an academic exercise. It's a very real challenge that many people are suffering, and we're all trying to do our best to tackle from all our different sectors and perspectives. So I congratulate you in launching this initiative. And I'm going to give just a brief overview because we don't have a lot of time, and hopefully you will delve deeper into the topics as the seminar progresses. So I'm going to talk about 2 things, basically a bit of definition, history, frameworks of science diplomacy for those of you that perhaps have not been exposed to the concept yet, and many people in the audience might be hearing about this term for the first time. And then we'll put it in context a little bit for COVID-19, and then we'll hear a lot more about it from Mauricio and the rest of you. So I will just, skip the index I just told you. So I think it's extremely important that we now finally recognize the many actors and levels and inputs that we have in diplomacy today. So in the 21st century, we see how globalization has intensified all cross-boundary interactions on pretty much every topic, and connecting people and also connecting problems in a way that we didn't have before. And so we find diplomacy in need to incorporate all of these new elements and perspectives in addition to the more traditional roles that diplomacy has played over the centuries. So, for example, we have climate change, which is a problem that we've known for many decades that exists, creating these new collective action problems for foreign policy and for economics and for defense and national security. So things that were before considered perhaps soft, like health or the environment, now are creating these very important national security, economic, and problems that are basically impacting the whole world, as the pandemic is giving us as the latest example. So we are faced with a new agenda, with a broader range of issue areas, and that has given rise to these new flavors or specialties in diplomacy, and we can discuss more about how that should be classified, right? But we have this digital diplomacy, health diplomacy, nuclear diplomacy, disaster diplomacy. So all of these new areas that diplomacy is connecting to more than ever, and of course science diplomacy is one of them. And the other thing we're seeing is that these new forms of diplomacy include a much broader set of actors and processes. So it's not only about diplomats, traditional diplomats conducting foreign affairs and on behalf of the governments appointed by their ministries and their governments. It's really now an ecosystem of state and non-state actors, cities, subnational levels, different geography, different geopolitical configurations that are really now making us rethink diplomacy, as you are doing in the seminar. So it is not, the word science and diplomacy are not words that we use to find together for a long time, both in the educational pathway and the professional pathway. Science and diplomacy have been siloed, and they have been in different paths. If you want to read more about this, I recommend a very good book from Dale Copeland, a former Canadian diplomat, who really lays out these differences in different worlds of science and diplomacy. But basically, we find now that we need to bring them together, but it is a challenge, as Bill was describing, to bring scientists and diplomats together, because they come from different worlds, different cultures, different training, different interests, different objectives. And it is now the work that many of us do to bring the communities together and help them understand each other and work together to solve these problems that require both of the communities to work together. But science diplomacy is not a new concept. It is a very old practice. It goes back centuries. And only in the 20th century, we have a number of very visible and prominent examples that, for instance, the US is featured in a number of them, using science as a way to come back from conflict. When two countries come back from political strain or from war, science is one of the first things that can be agreed to do together, right? Science is easy to agree because it's important for both, and it's less delicate or sensitive than other issues like human rights. So traditionally, science has been one of the first things that countries agree to do together, not only in the US, but also in Europe. So for instance, you will know the Large Hadron Collider and the CERN, which is a big physics laboratory in Geneva. It was built after World War II, and it helped bring together physicists from the Eastern and Western blocks of Europe after the war. And also it facilitated contacts between German and Israeli scientists at the time after the war. So it is a space that scientists can come together from all over the world, and it is easy to interact in science no matter how your governments get along, right? So science is a universal collaborative effort, and that provides a conduit and a channel for dialogue and for collaboration when perhaps other channels might be closed. And today we have this modern day example of the similar model from CERN in the Middle East, which is Sesame in Jordan, that brings together 10 countries that we might imagine they are not in the best diplomatic relation at the moment, like Israel or Iran or Palestine. They are working together in this synchrotron facility in Jordan. The concept, the official coining of the term science diplomacy came after this term of soft power also came about by Joseph Nye in Harvard Kennedy School in 2014. He published a very well-known book about soft power and how countries can use different ways to attract and to get others to do what they want that was not related to military action or economic force. So science is one of those sources of soft power. It is one of those assets that countries can leverage to attract, for instance, the best talent in the world. They can attract scientists to their laboratories, students to their universities, and obviously entrepreneurs and tech companies like we've seen, for instance, in the case of the United States or Silicon Valley. So science can be this source of soft power to really attract the best talent in the world to you and help you develop a competitive advantage of other countries. And so based on this history of this long tradition of practice of science diplomacy, in 2010, AAAS, which is the American Association for the Advancement of Science, best known as the publisher of Science magazine, together with the Royal Society in London, which is the Science Academy of the UK, they came up with this landmark report called New Frontiers in Science Diplomacy. And this report for the first time defined and gave a definition, a framework for science diplomacy to become a field or an area of study, of research, teaching, and also policy and practice, and help make it operational. So the definition that was given at the time was like that science is a common ground to build international partnerships, manage common resources, address shared challenges, and improve political relations between nations. This framework has evolved very much in the last 10 years, and science diplomacy is now a very rich academic discipline. But I'm not going to go over the evolution of the theory, because I think we want to focus more on the practical aspects of the topic of the day. But basically, this means that science, that diplomatic relations can help advance scientific efforts, that science information and scientists can help diplomats conduct their negotiations and their agreements and their work, but also science can help improve relations when those are under strain for different reasons, like we've seen, for instance, in the Cold War example. So very quickly, just to give you a bit of an illustration of each of those three pillars or dimensions of science diplomacy, or building blocks, as you call them. The first pillar of diplomacy for science, it's very easy. It's about the diplomatic apparatus helping advance scientific endeavor. For instance, one of the most visible examples of this is building a telescope, right? Or building a particle accelerator, like we've talked about from in Geneva with CERN. So those large scientific infrastructures are too expensive for any one country to build. And also it would not make sense for each country to have their own set of telescopes and their own colliders. It is much more efficient to build it in one place and then have everybody else contribute and all scientists work together in that particular facility. But because it involves countries from scientists from all over the world working together, it requires a diplomatic agreement. So many scientists don't know that underlying those large infrastructures lies a diplomatic treaty or agreement or different models of diplomatic instruments, because they need to come up with the rules and they need to negotiate where this instrument is going to be built, how much it's going to cost, who's going to pay for it, and what are the rules of membership, what happens if you don't pay. So all of those things are written off by the scientists as bureaucracy. And for a long time, it was really the kind of the worst part, the boring part of working in science, was to have to deal with this bureaucracy. But actually, it's a very important part in order for these mega scientific infrastructures to be built. And at the micro level as well, it's very important for diplomacy to help science, because scientists need visas. They travel around the world, they conduct field work in many places. And in the end, if you're a scientist, you need somebody to give you a visa for a particular country. So it is, although science does not require government intervention to function globally, right, for collaboration to happen, and we'll see that with COVID, you still need to move around and get your samples and get your permits, and that is another rule for the diplomatic community to support science. So this is a sample of all of these infrastructures that I talk about, that they are based on diplomatic agreements, they have member states, and they have diplomatic rules and processes to function. The second block, or the second pillar in science diplomacy, was called science in diplomacy. And we are very familiar with this because it's basically the same concept as science in policy, or evidence-informed policy. So it is more evident when we talk about the governance of international spaces, transnational resources, global commons. So the parts of our planet that we cannot manage at the national level because they fall outside of national jurisdictions. So Paul Bergman, who is a scholar of science diplomacy at Fletcher School, he made this very visual graph that really shows that after World War II, and mostly under the UN conventions, there was this increase in the treaties and the agreements that would for countries to agree to protect and manage common resources together. For instance, the Antarctic Treaty, the high seas, and many other agreements culminating, for instance, in the Paris Agreement only 5 years ago, that really require all countries to come together to manage this transboundary resources, but also these transboundary challenges and these transnational challenges, like in the case of infectious disease. So it is, science diplomacy can be a way to balance national and global or common interests. So if we think about the high seas, I mean, this map is very obvious. All the dark blue is basically the part of the ocean that lies under national jurisdiction, but all the light blue is the high seas. So basically 2/3 of our oceans do not belong to any one country. They are outside of any jurisdiction. And one of the poster child examples of science diplomacy is the Antarctic Treaty, which was signed in 1959 at the height of the Cold War. And it was the result of a very interesting exercise the year before the International Geophysical Year. Scientists from 12 countries had set up research stations in Antarctica, and they found after that year of research that the system of governance based on science worked so well that they should establish this as a permanent instrument for the common management of Antarctica. And basically it declares Antarctica as the continent reserved for science and peace, that all the territorial claims are suspended and countries agree to work together to help each other, to share data, because obviously it's a very hostile environment that I had the pleasure to visit last year, and it is really hard for any one researcher or any one station to work alone. So it is necessary to share infrastructure, to share equipment, to share icebreaker vessels, and so forth. So, so the Antarctic Treaty is one of those rare instances in which we have science as the form of governance of a part of a planet. Another very important example is the Montreal Protocol, which was the agreement that that set the path to close the hole in the ozone layer. As you know, there was an ozone hole on above Antarctica in the 80s, and it was due to these CFCs, the chemicals that are found in refrigerators and sprays and cans, and you probably remember those cans that say CFC or no CFC. Those chemicals were damaging the ozone layer. So it took the scientific community warning the diplomatic community and the world leaders to say, hey, we really need to do something about this because it's really harmful and it's going to have devastating consequences for our planet. And then it also got industry on board. So industry could phase out the production of those chemicals and basically innovate and find replacements that were harmless and they were benign with the environment. So it was a perfect alignment of a scientific, a diplomatic, and industry conversation that was even praised by former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan as the most successful environmental agreement to date. And I would love to hear your views after about whether you think that's still true. And of course, we have another very successful example at the time, 2015, the signing of the Paris Agreement. It was also praised as a great success of science diplomacy, climate diplomacy, managing to bring 195 countries on board. But of course, the world has changed quite a bit in the last few years, and we see this ambition sometimes reversed by certain countries that are key for the implementation. And so this is another work in progress that we have right now in the climate space. And so for the third pillar and final pillar of science diplomacy, as I mentioned, it's this idea that science is universal and the relationships between scientists can set aside some of those political tensions and work together despite what's going on between their governments. And so I was with AAAS for 5 years, and one of my main projects was to help restart the scientific cooperation between the US and Cuba. As you will know, both countries had no diplomatic relations for over 50 years, and there is a very important economic embargo of the US over Cuba that severely limited the opportunities for scientists to work together when they are so close, right? Two countries that are so close, they share the same challenges, they share environmental challenges, hurricanes and tropical storms, they share tropical diseases, and of course they share the same ocean and the same ecosystem. So it was a very big push from the scientific communities of both countries to really work with their governments and say, hey, we are sharing this common problem, we need to work together, and this diplomatic strain is really hindering our collaboration for the benefit and the interest of both societies and both countries. So it is now, as I said, a live case study in science diplomacy, because we are seeing a dramatic impact in both how science is done and also what's the impact in diplomacy and world politics, and wondering what's the world order that awaits us on the other side of this. And so COVID-19 arrives in a time for, unfortunately, a very low time for multilateralism, and that really didn't create the best conditions for a global pandemic to arrive, when so much of this trust in science, but also trust in diplomacy and global collaboration was diminished and eroded, and we'll talk about it more. But on the other hand, science has been working at full speed more than ever. Collaboration is really unprecedented, and we see this massive effort, joint effort towards, first of all, identifying what the virus was, sequencing. It was the fastest sequenced virus in history, and of course now working towards vaccines and therapeutics. So it is a stark contrast, the response from the scientific community and the response from world leaders. And I mean, the good thing about this case studies that we get all of our headlines from the media, right? So this is one of my favorite articles. If you haven't had the chance to read it, it really encapsulates a lot of this. It's New York Times a couple of weeks ago, and they said, COVID-19 changed how the world does science together, and in contrast of how political leaders are locking their borders and scientists are shattering theirs. So it is, as I said, the picture in the geopolitical space is very different. We're seeing a lot of these attempts of soft power coming from China. Also Cuba is another one, medical diplomacy, mask diplomacy, coronavirus diplomacy, all of these terms have also been coined, but also we see not just the unilateral responses and not the fragmented and uncoordinated responses. We're seeing how countries are being left behind because they're under sanctions, or of course, countries in conflict. So the UN Secretary General called for a global ceasefire and to temporarily suspend sanctions, because obviously that so sanctions make banking transactions very difficult for countries to, for instance, import the medical supplies that they need. So it is also, I think, important to understand, and Mauricio will talk about it at length, to understand what the role of these multilateral institutions is. We've seen a lot of blame on WHO, we've seen a lot of blame on the EU, and so it's important for us to do a better job at communicating what these UN agencies, the EU can do or cannot do, because people think the UN is a world government. They can't do anything inside a country's jurisdiction. They cannot tell any country what to do. And actually, WHO is led by member states. So it is really a representation of member states that decides what to do. So it's not a separate government that decides things. And the same with the EU. The EU is based on shared competences. So it is true that the first response was disappointing and it was late. But also, the EU does not have competences in health. Each member states, decide what competences are going to give to the supranational body and what competences they are going to keep. And health is not one of those. So it is important, I think, for one of the messages that I'm trying to get across these days is to do a better job at understanding, to help understand what those institutions, multilateral bodies can and cannot do, and if they are failing, how can we support them? How can we rebuild them? What are the different, the new strategies that we can use to help them help us in the time of crisis? So very quickly, what can we do to boost science diplomacy? So first of all, there are many sectors to work with, and I'm trying to work with as many as I can these days, but obviously strengthening capacities in foreign ministries, diplomatic academies. So as I was saying, diplomacy is a very traditional career, and profiles are usually very generalist, so they might not have scientific training, so it is important to bring those issues into diplomatic training foreign ministries in many countries. As Bill and Chris were saying, there are now countries that are launching their own science diplomacy strategies. So I was involved in helping, for instance, Panama or Spain in developing and launching those strategies, which means bringing together all the stakeholders first at the national level. And sometimes it means the science ministry talking to the foreign ministry, which is not always the case. And so by building a strategy for science diplomacy, you get actually your own stakeholders at the domestic level talking to each other. So if you want to explore some of those strategies, I can share this presentation. The links are there. One of the my favorite ones, and one that has been used by many countries as a model, is the Madrid Declaration on Science Diplomacy, which was created by this consortium, a European Horizon 2020 project, S4D4C, that I'm part of. And it also comes from a very top-down push from the former Commissioner for Research and Innovation in Europe, Carlos Moedas, who made science diplomacy a priority for EU global action. And finally, the training. We've already talked about how we met. We met in Trieste with Chris and Bill in this Train the Trainers course with AAAS and the World Academy of Sciences. And it's fundamental to get scientists to know how to communicate research, but also to understand how policy works, how diplomacy works, and how you can impact it, because this is nowhere in a traditional scientific training. And many scientists really aspire to impact policy and to have a good, to have a positive impact in the world, but you cannot impact something that you don't understand how it works. So it's very important to provide this training as early as possible. In 2017, we published this landscape analysis of different ways for countries to arrange their science policy interfaces, and we collected these mechanisms in this report that is also available to you. You can also watch an online course on science diplomacy, which is free on the AAAS website, and number of articles that I've published recently on the topic of science diplomacy and COVID. So I'll stop there. There's a lot to unpack, and thank you, and moving on to Mauricio.
Thank you, Marga. Before Mauricio starts, there are questions, but at this point we will ask the questions at the end. We do have more, just for those who join maybe later. If you have questions, use the Q&A function to send it to us. And thank you, Marga. Mauricio, it would be great now to start with you. I want just to say that some of the material that you mentioned, we will post most of, not only the slides, but also the documents, the links to the documents in our website. So we will notify the attendees about that. Thank you, Marga. Mauricio.
Okay. First of all, I want to bid a hello to everyone around the world that's watching us, and to thank Duke and the DUCIGS team for the invitation. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be able to share with you some insights today. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. What I was asked by the organizers to do was to make some brief reflections and share some insights about global health security and science diplomacy, obviously related to the pandemic and a little bit about in the post-COVID world. And provocatively, I think that this is a game of high stakes, black boxes, truth-telling, intelligence, all hopefully for the global common good, particularly if we get rid of the black boxes and so on. Anyway, as Chris mentioned, I work with Sustainable Healthy Habitats and Healthy Humans for Peace, and that is for positive peace, and I hope that we have the opportunity on another occasion to talk about that. Okay, this is the brief thematic. There you go. The brief list of themes that I'm going to mention. First, a little bit of the global health security framework, health as a global common good, pertinence of science and diplomacy and COVID, the relationship of those two themes and areas of work and thought, the way forward for the pandemic response, and there I will stop a little bit and I will share with you what I believe is an example of very good science diplomacy at work. And then just a few comments about the way forward towards a new normal post-COVID that many people in the world, like me, we are thinking we have an opportunity for. For some reason, the slide changer is delayed. I don't know what's going on. Here we go. That's better. Like that. Okay. So regarding global health security, it's clear to say that today's world is very interconnected through the globalization of travel and trade, population mobility, the globalization of conflict, and all of this increases the risks to public health. and that preventing and reducing the likelihood of disease outbreaks is essential to save lives and reduce suffering globally. To achieve this, the world must move towards a comprehensive global system of defense and response to disease threats. Simply to mention them, the international health regulations, which many of you probably have heard about, are one of the tools within the global health security framework, but not the only ones. They're important simply because they are the standing instrumental methodologies in order to do things like, for example, declare a public health emergency of international concern, which, as you probably remember, was precisely one of the milestones in this pandemic, like it is in any other epidemic event. The Global Health Security Agenda was launched in 2014 and now numbers more than 50 countries with a steering group of nations around the globe. It has as its objective to strengthen national and international capacity to prevent, detect, and respond to infectious disease threats. And it tries to do this by training healthcare workers, establishing surveillance systems, reporting and emergency response, ensuring laboratory capacity, and strengthening health systems overall. Now, as to the concept of considering health as a global common good, and this has to do with something that Marga mentioned, in the realm of science and policy for the global commons. The following, and Marga already made mention of some of this, the following can be included in the global common goods: human health, healthy wild and domesticated fauna and flora, natural environment and transboundary resources that enable health and well-being, built habitats that enable health and well-being. Some of these are obviously considered, analyzed in the One Health and in the planetary health frameworks and approaches. But relatively recently, the World Bank declared pandemic preparedness as a global public good, simply to establish a number of market mechanisms and to place it in centrally in the assurance of global health security. Now, as to the pertinence of science diplomacy in the COVID world, I'm simply going to mention that science diplomacy is an approach to overcome challenges imposed by traditional ways of thinking about public policy design and decision making. Marga went over this already. And to again say that we live in a highly interconnected world where most of the challenges and opportunities must be globally understood and locally owned. And this locality, like it's called, is very important for us to remember later on as we see whether policies are applicable or can be instrumented locally when they come from regional or global or multilateral sources. The COVID-19 pandemic represents definitely a game-changing challenge for global peace and security. It is a major threat multiplier as it has the potential to exacerbate other global and local problems already present. And definitely science diplomacy, meaning by this the international cooperation with science at its core, is key to overcoming COVID-19 and its effects throughout the world. Now, as to an example of diplomacy and science to inform policy for the common good, I'm going to discuss with you what the European Union, the European Commission have done recently. To frame this, all European Union member states prohibited public gatherings, closed schools, introduced border and travel restrictions in response to the COVID pandemic. More than half of the European Union states proclaimed a state of emergency, and restrictive measures were necessary to slow down the spread of the virus, coming, as they do, at a very high social and economic cost. So, in the 26th of March, after a couple of months of very hard and very interesting work, the European Commission launched a joint European roadmap towards lifting COVID-19 containment measures. And I want to present it to you, and I'm going to briefly go over some of its aspects. I'm not going to read everything that is in the presentation. I put it there since the presentation is going to be available for everybody afterwards, so you can look at some of those details. But I do think that this is a very good example of good practice of diplomacy and science informing policy for the common good. First of all, the roadmap considers scientific advice, coordination, and solidarity in the European Union as key principles for the member states to successfully lift the current confinement measures. And the roadmap responds to the European Council call for an exit strategy that will prepare the ground for a comprehensive recovery plan and the associated investments. The objectives of the roadmap include commitment to protect the European Union citizens while preserving European values, respond to the urgency of fighting the COVID-19 and its immediate consequences, and it calls for preparing the measures necessary to get European societies and economies back to a normal functioning and to sustainable growth, integrating into this both the green transition and the digital transformation frameworks. And very importantly, it calls for drawing all the lessons from the crisis, for systematically documenting and doing knowledge transfer of all lessons from the crisis. We'll go over that in a moment again, a little bit more. It definitely declares that scientific evidence is the guiding light for this roadmap. And the conditions and criteria under which containment measures can be lifted depend largely on data that are developing over time. It has that clarity. It is not a snapshot. It is a moving understanding throughout a situation that is highly dynamic, right? And the things that obviously change over time are the level of transmission of the virus in the affected regions, the development and duration of immunity to the virus among the population, how different age groups are affected by disease, among other things, yeah? Also, it clearly states that reliable data will minimize the risk of decisions based on incorrect assumptions or incomplete information. It includes recommendations based on scientific knowledge available to date that will be revised as new evidence appears, and establishes that this new evidence can be produced obviously by national data, becoming more comparable and measuring methods being more harmonized. There are 3 sets of criteria to assess whether the time has come to begin the relaxation of the confinement measures. We're simply going to mention them. They are epidemiological criteria, health system capacity, and appropriate monitoring capacity of testing and contact tracing. In terms of the basic principles for the roadmap, the first one is that action should be based on evidence and have public health at its center. Here it's important to highlight that the available scientific evidence must inform decisions as much as possible, and member states should be ready to revise their approaches as more scientific evidence appears. The second basic principle is that actions should be coordinated between the member states, since a lack of coordination in lifting restrictive measures poses the very important risk of having negative effects for all, among other things, the reinitiation of transmission chains and such other things. The third principle is respect and solidarity between member states as an essential issue. It is stated that a key success factor in this phase is to build on each other's strengths, and that this will lead the way to further solidarity measures at the EU level to support some member states and regions that require particular help for specific problems. Recommendations include that action will be gradual, that most vulnerable groups should be protected for longer, that the lifting of measures should start with those with a local impact and be gradually extended. Something happened here, I'm sorry. And be gradually extended to measures with broader geographic coverage, depending on the national specificities. Also, that the restart of economic activity should be phased in, ensuring that authorities and businesses can adequately adjust to increasing activities in a safe way. That all the efforts to prevent the spread of the virus should be sustained, and that all actions should be continuously monitored and preparedness developed for returning to stricter containment measurements as necessary. Again, all this based on the scientific evidence as it evolves and is communicated. Now, some very quick thoughts about a way forward towards a new normal post-COVID. It is said that times of upheaval are always times of radical change. And some people believe that this pandemic is a once-in-a-generation chance to remake society and build a better future for everybody. Other people fear that it may only make existing injustices worse. So I guess we have to work for one and try to avoid the other. If we say that indeed there's a once-in-a-generation chance to remake society and build a better future, we need to look for models, proposed development frameworks. And this is just an example of one that I happen to like a lot, in which indeed, if we set ourselves in the post-COVID new global order to set up for a new way of doing things, we probably should work towards a safe and just space for humanity. And at the same time that we avoid critical planetary degradation and obviously work towards eliminating critical human deprivation. This is from the work of Kate Raworth, her excellent book, Donut Economics, which I highly recommend for everybody to read. Now, as requisites for this, we definitely would need a common understanding from shared data and information sets as the basis for collaborative decision and action and transparency. The black boxes that I referred to at the beginning of my comments need to be eliminated, particularly those black boxes that translate into asymmetry of the influence in partnerships. Many partnerships, international partnerships, suffer from the information and knowledge asymmetry. So the people who have lesser access to data, information, and intelligence are at a disadvantage and typically don't get the best out of the partnership as was desired. Now, there's definitely an opportunity for harmonization with the global development agenda in this new normal for post-COVID. And simply to remember that we are in the decade of action towards the 2030 horizon. And the 2030 agenda provides a blueprint for shared prosperity in a sustainable world, in a world where all people can live productive, vibrant, and peaceful lives on a healthy planet. Now, progress is being made. Although we just started this decade, some progress is being made, but overall action to meet the Sustainable Development Goals is not advancing at the speed or scale required. And obviously, the COVID pandemic has, if nothing else, thrown a wrench in the spiked wheel of progress towards the SDGs. So we need to retake that agenda in the post-COVID reality. Now, the decade of action calls for accelerating sustainable solutions to all the world's biggest challenges, including post-COVID, humanitarian need, poverty, gender, climate change, inequality, and increased needs in the face of limited financing. All of these made worse by the COVID pandemic. Now, The coming years definitely represent a vital period to save the planet and to achieve sustainable, inclusive human development, as was mentioned to us by the United Nations Secretary General recently. I think that we need to all decide to work together to flatten this curve. You know, the one that is imposed by our our pre-COVID standing socioeconomic model, and try to really live within the Earth's sustainability capacity and change the way we do certain things. For everybody, do get in touch with me, not only for if you need any answers or if you have any questions regarding my comments. I'll be happy to respond to everyone. We are in the hyper-connected world, and networking and connecting with people is one of the delectable pleasures that we can enjoy nowadays. I'll stop there. And thank you all for your attention, and I'm available for the rest of the seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Mauricio, and thank you for the slides. And again, we will post all this material for those who are here and also for those who have not been able to join us today. Now, Bill and Chris, it's your show, and please go ahead. We have half an hour, more or less, so please take your time, and also we will ask questions there are questions from the floor. Bill.
Chris, do you want me to start?
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
So there are actually some very excellent questions on the Q&A, and they overlap with some of the things that Chris and I were gonna talk about, or I guess raise for the two discussants speakers as well. So the first one really has to do with what Marga was saying about multilateralism, and I think, you know, I actually missed that article on the New York Times. I actually, that's a great article, how you mentioned that you know, the scientists are opening their borders and working together better, but the politicians seem to be following a different route. And this leads me to this question about, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has essentially opened the playbook of peer review and scientific review to the public. So there is, every day we see scientific information supposedly published, but it's occurring in a non-peer reviewed space. And I think the communication of that information is being relayed to politicians, and that can go everything from, if you followed the Santa Clara County estimates, to using chloroquine as a treatment, to ultraviolet light, disinfectants being injected into your body. These things are occurring in non-peer-reviewed literature, but being communicated by policymakers as actually peer-reviewed science. And then that causes a very confusing communication to the public, and whether or not the trustworthiness of science is really still at the same level. And at the same time, there's a lot of this increasing questions that, say, the United States is putting towards the World Health Organization on whether or not you know, information coming from the WHO should really be trusted anymore. So I'm wondering, how does this rapid production of science, which I think is a great thing, actually, but also the fact that we're communicating it publicly without vetting it very well as scientists and communicating it well to policymakers, how is this influencing our ability to conduct science diplomacy, not just for COVID, but for things like climate change or environmental change? And this could be a question for Mauricio or for Marga.
I can go. Am I on? Yes. Ramon. Yeah, that is an excellent reflection. I think you just hit the $1 million question. So for me, as a molecular biologist, I was, in the beginning, so pleased to see, concepts of, PCR, antibodies, epidemiological concepts, mathematics. I was like, wow, this is amazing. It's like primetime television. I'm seeing my work, my background that was always so obscure and so, impossible to get across. Now it's like all over the place, trending topics, front page of the newspapers. I thought, great. It's like a massive global science science class, right? In real time. But then, as you say, with the preprints and the rapid publication and how now the media is taking the information from the preprints, not from peer-reviewed published articles, it's a new problem, right? So we've all been, probably in favor of open access and advocates for opening up scientific results as fast as possible to as many people as possible, obviously. But then we are confronted with this, I think, dilemma. And I saw somebody writing about, yes, preprints are great, but not for COVID, like not now. Can we just wait and have a proper peer review? Or I saw also a course for media on how to interpret a preprint, like, so how to understand that is not yet the consensus that the scientific community has arrived to, but it's one paper from one lab that is proposing that and launching it into the peer review, the process. So I think that also speaks about the communication of uncertainty, which has been a problem for environmental diplomacy for forever, but now it's really acute. Like, how do you interpret uncertainty? How scientists can relay their recommendations, their science advice, but in a way that acknowledges that uncertainty that's inherent to science. And I think the credibility of the WHO, as you mentioned, and these attacks come from, one day you're saying this, but then the next day you're saying something else, or, COVID is airborne and then it's not, and wear masks and not wear masks and gloves and whatever. So how can we find the right, the middle ground in which we can communicate that uncertainty, but also we can basically provide actionable advice? Because that's, the challenge of science advice right now is all these committees and emergency COVID response committees are struggling to relay the information in a way, because that's going to have very big consequences for that country and for the world. And so it is a massive responsibility. But also I think we have to understand and remember that science advice is not, like, scientists do not dictate policy. So it's still the policymaker, is still in the hands of the decision makers to take that advice. So scientists provide those options, provide the information, but of course in a way that is actionable.
Yeah, if I may share my screen for a moment, I want to share with everybody a cartoon that appeared recently. And I think that tells part of the story that we need to talk about. Okay, there we go. Which is that basically, this is in Spanish and I didn't have the time to translate it, but basically shows how the scientific community, as it speaks about COVID-19 or any other topic for that matter, the politicians and the press and other constituencies talk about COVID-19, they basically are talking different languages with different priorities for different interested audiences. And I guess while not saying that the requisite for peer review and reproducibility be forgotten, definitely the scientific community needs to understand that it probably needs to talk at least 2 languages. The one that we have been used to up to now, And then a language for those other interested audiences, including those politicians and the press and all those other sectors of society that need to understand the evidence that we produce as we do science. As data is analyzed and information is generated and it's analyzed and the intelligence is generated to be acted upon. So sort of a harmonization of languages and agendas is necessary. The cartoon basically says, you know, the scientists on top, they say, it seems that as we go discovering, we have to confirm, we have to study further, when we can assure that while the politicians, as you can see there, is what is clear is, without a doubt we are going to, right? What we are going to do urgently is, and the solution is very simple. And then things like, you know, injecting bleach and all these other things come about. So anyway, I want to share this with you because I feel that it does touch that point, and it's a rather important one, that we don't forget that we need to talk the language for the other interested audiences and stop being so endogamic in the science world. Thank you. Trying to.
So Bill, I think I suggest that we go to some of the questions coming from the audience. So I have some questions, but we can open the discussion. Giovanni, you have some of them.
Sure. So there are several questions. Some you answered some of the questions already, but there is one in particular from Uruguay. A question for Marga. Do you think since COVID-19, science diplomacy is going to have a more important role in emergency response? Marga?
Yes, good question.
If you can keep the answer short, because we have some questions.
I think the short answer is yes, it should be. Until now, science diplomacy was not a mainstream term. It was something that still remained very on the margins, and it is not an element of any foreign policy or any national strategy yet, apart from those countries that I mentioned. It is not mainstream. So I think it can help us realize its value, and then we can get, I think, the support in each of the sectors, from academia, from the policy world, and all of the other members of the ecosystem, to really invest in building that capacity and that connection. So my answer is, I hope, yes. I cannot, see the future, but I would imagine if we are going to go into the right path, and also what Mauricio presents in terms of strengthening the multilateral system instead of going the other way around.
If I may make an observation, as a practitioner, both in government and in the coordination of the response to large-scale emergencies, I couldn't agree more. One of the things that, and by the way, one of the things that is going to make emergency response and humanitarian action sustainable is that it does respond to evidence gathering, analysis, and intelligence production, so that it is objective. For decades, we have done emergency response and humanitarian action on the basis of, I have been there and done that, so I should know what I'm doing, without being objective, doing observational, operational research in the field, and truly understanding what's going on, what are the needs, and what should come first, and when. Thank you.
Giovanni, I would like to, Mauricio, you mentioned during your presentation two concepts that are quite relevant, and we at DUC, we have been working on that. And actually, Bill, you have a course that is shared with UNC, University of North Carolina, and NC State on One Health. And you mentioned also planetary health. How do you see the global emergency, the global health emergency framework changing in the years forward, attending to these holistic approaches to health? How planetary health, for instance, is going to be a more relevant concept and a more used concept as a platform to bring people from the environmental, the health, and the governance part coming together, and how it aligns with science diplomacy.
That is precisely why I mentioned them, because I believe firmly that new normal post-COVID that we should strive forward towards ought to have a vision and an action framework like the one that is proposed, both through One Health and Planetary Health. They are not mutually exclusive. So I believe firmly that that's what we should be working on, right? Make sure that we understand that human health at any level, at the micro, meso, or the global level, human health is dependent upon the health of the habitat and the sustainability of the natural resources, and our living within the limits of that can be sustained by our global village. As you know, when people ask me where I come from, I say that I come from the pale blue dot. I'm a pale blue dotian because there's one blue planet, beautiful planet, but it's the only one we have. So we need to really take good care of it. Anyway, I'll stop there.
We are pale blue dotians.
We had another nice question that I was thinking as well. So there's limits to both science and diplomacy, and Camila Alva has a question in the Q&A that I think is very relevant. She's in the Peruvian Ministry of Environment, and she writes, what types of tools does science diplomacy have to make governments take action on science that have demonstrated to be good or relevant? And I think the specific question that I was kind of thinking about, which is along the lines that she has in her question, is, science has limits and diplomacy has limits, and what are those limits and how do we overcome them?
Marga, you want to comment?
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Because I have an answer, but I would like to hear you.
Yes, there are many answers to this one. I think one of the key features of parts of this question is that diplomacy is changing, and I think that still there's a tension within diplomacy, right, within the field, between the kind of traditional diplomacy and those new diplomacies or new flavors or whatever we want to call them, right? And so there's some resistance in many governments, in many countries, to kind of open up to those, different actors and different inputs. And so there are foreign services that are very strict, very traditional. They don't have, these ins and outs that allow, for instance, scientists to go and spend time with the diplomats. So, for instance, in the US, there are so many programs that you can take, policy fellowships, embassy science fellows. There are many ways for a scientist to be placed and to function, or at least for a period of time, in the world of diplomacy and understand how it works, right? Or to be part of a multilateral negotiation or delegate or a national delegation to a particular negotiation. But in many countries, this is really still very, it's just not common, and is also looked at as some sort of scientists intruding in the profession and kind of distorting it, or it's a very prestigious profession, and so there's a tension there. Even sometimes there are legal issues. So there, in this landscape analysis that I showed in 2017, we looked at the barriers for science policy and science diplomacy engagement. And one of them was that there were so countries had no ways of having scientists in a government office, just like, not even like an internship. In Panama, for instance, we worked with the foreign minister and vice president. She had to go to parliament to change the law as to who is allowed to enter the foreign service. So if a scientist or engineer, somebody, or a doctor, somebody with a non-traditional background wanted to enter the diplomatic service, they couldn't. So it is still, very traditional in terms of the profiles that get into diplomatic service, like, of course, international relations, political science, law, and so forth. And this is not to say that scientists need to become diplomats or they need to leave, research or the lab and become something else. But it is kind of the boundary spanning people, the profession that doesn't yet exist. And I see many questions about careers here in the Q&A. Is not a career path that is set that you can just take, like when you are a lawyer or you're a medical doctor, that you have your career path set for life, right? Then you know what's coming after each stage. Here it's really kind of do it yourself, find your own path. And so having foreign ministries and governments be more sensitive to this diversity of profiles and different expertise that is needed into the diplomacy ecosystem is one of the ways to I think, overcome some of the disconnect.
I just want to mention something, and that is that for those people who live in countries where there are no strong advisory scientific resources, like many of the low and very low resourced countries in the world are, then there's a question of who should the diplomats listen to, and who should the policymakers listen to? Because obviously, going back to the black boxes, if the key intelligence that you can act upon is not available, and you need to take a decision for your country and your people, then you're stuck. So also, I would suggest that one of the things that we need to do is, from both the science and the diplomatic worlds, to sort of do a lot more sharing. And there is a trend now that talks that we should go from global health security to global health sharing. And I agree with that, precisely because of this. We need to make available to everybody that has the responsibility to generate policy or to make a diplomatic agreement, a commercial agreement, to be able to have available reliable sources of information and intelligence. Thank you.
Bill, go ahead. We can two more questions and then some final remarks, but go ahead.
I just realized that we actually didn't tackle the two cases of exceptionalism that we have for today, that are the United States and Sweden. But then it might be a good opportunity for all of us here in the panel to eventually write something about that and definitely try to publish something so we share this discussion in a different format with our audience. And Bill, I don't know if you want to close, if you have some remarks, because we have actually 3 minutes on.
Well, I think Giovanni just said we can probably take 1 or 2 more questions and then.
One more? Okay.
Just quick.
Yeah, I'll take it from the Q&A. I think this was the first question that was posed, and I like it because it's a very easy, quick question. And the question comes from Amanda Frederick, asking, what are the unique challenges involved with science diplomacy amid this pandemic, and how might these challenges be addressed? And instead of thinking about all the challenges, I would just ask Marga and Mauricio just to think about, like, what's the one most important challenge that we face with the COVID-19 pandemic, and then how we work around that in science diplomacy.
Marga, go ahead.
I guess I start. Okay, pick one challenge. I think it's, okay, if I have to pick one, the fact that many countries that did have robust and very established science advisory systems did not necessarily take that advice, and that relates to the US and Sweden, as you wanted to focus on those countries. So it is, again, as we were saying, a case study because we used to say, well, you know, if you have a science advisory system, an emergency response committee, all of that, then you're set. And that means your country is good and it's prepared. Now we're seeing that having those structures in place, no matter how, you know, old traditions of science advice, like in the UK, like in the US, that doesn't mean the leaders are going to use them or listen to them. So I think this is a challenge for all of us as a community to really study and really try to understand. So what are the, other approaches, and what else do we need if those advisory systems fail or are not used, even if they are available. And on that note, I will share that there is a very good policy tracker from the International Network for Government Science Advice, INGSA. So INGSA.org COVID, they are collecting each, and they have a national level correspondent in each country that is reporting exactly on that question. How did the science advice work or didn't work? What failed? What was successful? So I think that also helps us give bring the full picture, perhaps for future seminars.
For me, the challenge is transparency. Both for transparency that is related to verifiable by peers evidence, both for the socialization of information and actual intelligence inwards in the countries and outwards for the global response. If we truly work on transparency, then obviously what we all want, which is that we survive as a global community the COVID pandemic, and that we have a proper post-COVID social order, then we need to work on transparency.
Thank you. So, Bill, would you like to say something? Otherwise, I have a couple of remarks just about the program, but
yeah, I'll just say very great answers. Thank you both for that. I wanted to thank you guys for joining us. It's great that you kicked off this seminar series. We had roughly 160 people register for the event. I think I saw the numbers go up to about 120 who were logged in, it's amazing since we just started publishing this and advertising it less than a week ago. So that just speaks to the amazing communication team at DUCIGS in terms of getting the word out about this seminar. I will mention, just for my biggest concern with science diplomacy and COVID, it overlaps with what Marga is saying, and it's essentially the unilateral work and efforts that countries go on, which is the exceptionalism issue that we were going to bring up on the discussion. And I think that's a very dangerous movement by governments, not just for COVID, but it really mimics the fact that as we tackle global challenges like the Sustainable Development Goals or like climate change, it becomes problematic and kind of a litmus test for how we might be moving into the future. Hopefully not, and hopefully we can continue to learn about science diplomacy and continue to become better communicators between science and diplomats. But we'll have many more of these seminars, at least 2 more on coronavirus, and then we'll be continuing the discussion about science diplomacy in other topics as well as we move forward. Chris, I don't know if you have anything else that you wanted to say?
Yes, one point that we probably didn't mention, but is important, is the issue of human rights and how public health and emergency epidemiological decisions have affected millions of people around the world, and under emergency and exceptional measures. I got a question from a lawyer that I have here at home, and we have discussing a lot about human rights these days, and it's going to come to a more kind of prominent space in at the level of diplomatic bodies, but also civil society organizations working towards how we are going to protect liberties and etc. This is something that we definitely are going to try to tackle in future webinars on science diplomacy and COVID. And just closing, thank you so much, Marga and Mauricio, for joining us. And we hope and look forward to having you in the next webinar, probably in 2 weeks' time. Thank you so much. Back to you, Giovanni.
So thank you very much. And also thank you to the attendees that patiently stayed online until 1:33. We are sorry that we couldn't answer all the questions. We will record them, and we will try to answer some of those questions in the upcoming events. I can tell you that certainly the WHO issue will be dealt with in some of the future events, and also the way that some countries are dealing with the WHO and the impact that is having on the, someone said, the global south, meaning on countries that do not have health system that has developed as in advanced economies. So I think these are questions that we will deal with within this framework and also within other webinars part of the Rethinking Diplomacy program. I want just to say another point, because I know some students ask questions about programs. One of the reasons we started the Rethinking Diplomacy program a couple of months ago with the support of the Trend Foundation is precisely to train not only DUC students, but also students from other universities in rethinking diplomacy in a way in which we bring together specializations with diplomatic skills. Science diplomacy is, of course, one of the major frameworks, but within that, of course, there are different specializations. And there are also fields outside what the typical science diplomacy fields, which also will provide skills that once, together with diplomatic skills, can be used by students in the, not only the academic career, but definitely after they graduate. So stay tuned. We will certainly send more information. We will also post some of the resources that Marga and Mauricio shared with us, and I'm sure Bill and Chris will add to those. And thank you very much. Thank you very much to the DUCIGS team, in particular to Ping, Amanda, Jason, Gianluca, and Renate for having organized this webinar. Thank you, and thank you, Marga and Mauricio. We had people from all around the world, so this is also a theme that is certainly attracting a lot of attention, not only in the US. Thank you very much, and see you soon.